Hello, I'm Helen Daly. Welcome to Business View, where we gather some of the best brains in business journalism and they give us their take on the week's top stories. And of course, it's been a very... What's your view? Because in this, the RBA has stuck by the rate rise this week, saying it was prudent. But you'd have to sort of, ask, did the community really need it?
I guess in terms of needing a rate rise, you can argue people don't want rate rises because obviously mortgage payments go up, but there are obviously people that benefit from interest rate rises, and there's people on pensioners, people on fixed incomes, people with savings accounts benefit when interest rates go up. So it's not the media loves to portray interest rate rises as being a terrible thing across the board. They're not necessarily terrible across the board. A lot of people who own houses don't have mortgages at all. So it's about around a third of the people in the economy will, to an extent, suffer. But we still have to remember that interest rates are still below an average of the last 25 years, so they still aren't certainly high. And obviously I heard you mention CPI being 2.7. You've got to question how CPI is calculated and what obviously the basket they use. Items like electricity, water, gas have gone up far more than 2.7%. The ABS don't include asset price increases in calculations of CPI. So if a house price goes up and you're paying a higher amount of interest because your purchase price is higher, that doesn't get included in CPI. So there's a lot of factors that aren't included in CPI that arguably you could say could be or should be.
Yeah.
So we're getting possibly an understated CPI figure.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting because, I mean, the Reserve Bank, in its indications about the rate rise on Melbourne Cup Day, certainly we're talking about, well, a lot of the economists seem to think, well, they're really, in fact, Craig James, I think, said, it was a gamble, he thought, from CommSec, that, they're really betting on the continued rising prices for commodities, continued strength out of China, and that in a sense it was kind of a preemptive strike by the RBA before too much heat gets into the economy. And as you say, from the consumer's point of view, the everyday consumer, they're not necessarily feeling the impact of great price rises in iron ore and coal, but they are seeing these incredible jumps, it seems, in electricity, gas, water prices, all those sorts of things, and that's impacting on their spending power. So there is this very much sort of two-speed, multi-speed economy, Adam.
There is, and whilst it certainly hasn't been stated, my gut feeling is the RBA is very aware of the house price bubble, and they're trying to take the wind out of house prices as best they can without causing a catastrophic fall. They've tried jawboning house prices down, it hasn't worked. House prices still increasing, not everywhere, but in Melbourne they're up a couple of percent last quarter.
Yeah, but they're not flying as high, are they?
They seem to be flattening, yeah.
Yeah, they haven't been increasing as much.
It depends how you look at it. If you look at the Financial Review had a great graphic about 2 weeks ago, and it looked at the yields received by property investors. And not only do you have house prices still increasing, especially in Melbourne, you've got actually rents in some parts dropping. So you're getting yields of 2% for house prices. Arguably, that's about 50% too low. So the RBA, I've no doubt, is aware that the house prices, as Jeremy Grantham has said, the only two bubbles that have never popped is the Australian and British house price markets. I've no doubt the RBA's, they've seen what's happened in the US. A house price collapse leads to a collapse in the general economy. Yeah. I think the RBA is very concerned that will happen.
But Adam, sorry, Helen, you mentioned mortgages. Yes, of course, only a third of the population have mortgages. But what about business lending and business borrowers? Do you think there's going to be any big impact on them from the rate rise?
Well, business I think is struggling to get finance as it is. Banks simply aren't lending to businesses. So whether what the rate is less of a concern than simply the availability of finance. But it's actually another interesting point that you sort of mentioned, how if you look at don't want to jump the gun, but just the way banks are lending and just so willing to lend to residential borrowers, but not to business borrowers.
Well, I guess that's all about risk, isn't it? I mean, I've heard Ralph Norris, among others, say that that's really the reason why small businesses have to pay a lot higher rates for their loans is because they are riskier business. So unless they want to put their house up as collateral, they have to pay the higher interest rate.
It depends how you classify risk, Helen. If you look at houses, they're not houses in the US 2 years ago were extremely risky asset. They've dropped 50%.
Sure.
So you've got risk is about what the price is, not what traditionally has been over the last 100 years. I'd argue that investment in a residential property at the moment is an extremely risky investment.
All right, Lachlan, I mean, there's really do need to return to a budget surplus if the dollar is going to have an impact on that.
It's an interesting one. The economists are one of the few people to treat thinking in a different way to you and I. If we ran our household spending more than we earned, we wouldn't last very long. Yet economists and politicians think that governments, and look at the US as a great example, or Greece even better, think they can run these constant deficits and that sometime in the future the money will come from somewhere. It doesn't seem to happen that way. The welfare state, as it sits, paying all these substantial amounts in fiscal stimulus, in welfare payments, in Medicare, in the US in Medicaid, it can't last forever. And if you look at the deficits in the US, if you look at there's a Boston University professor, and his name escapes me, it's quite a long name. He was saying how if you look at the actual US deficit, it's something like 200 trillion if you factor in all the unfunded state pension liabilities and Medicare liabilities. So to suggest that we can just maintain, and Australia's obviously not so bad with the low levels of public debt.
No, and look, I take that point, and obviously what we've seen, you know, the unrest we've seen in Europe about when governments are suddenly trying to perhaps cut back, you know, the communities are saying, you know, no way, it's causing quite a lot of community and civil unrest there. And of course we've seen politically in the United States what happens when people say, you know, no more debt. But I guess, you know, I don't want to put Australia in that same category, Adam, and I guess what those two economists were saying is that, you know, at a time when we are in a much better place, is it the right time to be returning to surplus, particularly if the dollar is going to have an impact on that?
Interesting, have a look at, obviously Australia's got a low level of public debt, but so did the US and so did Ireland before their housing markets collapsed. What became private liabilities were switched onto the public balance sheet. And Australia's got a lot of public debt, a lot of private debt, I should say. Yeah. If you look at the household debt, we're actually more than the US, I think. So that can, if things go awry in the housing market, that private debt will very quickly be transferred to public balance sheet. Suddenly, our low public debt of 20% won't be that way for very long, I suspect.
All right, so you reckon we've got to really stick to that goal, which obviously Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan have promised, but they are saying that the dollar rising is eating into revenues.
It's certainly, well, the dollar rising, people cheer on the dollar like it's a football score, when certainly there's some people, importers certainly benefit from a higher dollar, and if you're buying stuff from the United States, if you're buying books from Book Depository, that's great, but for exporters, it's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. Did you want to have a comment or view about the CBA move?
I agree with Lachlan in a sense that banks, the problem that banks have at the moment is that they get about a third of their funding from overseas. Overseas funding is getting more expensive. They have to roll over their finance they got before the GFC. So the actual bank margin, if you look at Westpac's margin, it released its results earlier this week in a record $6.3 billion profit, their margin actually dropped. They're making less money off of residential mortgages than they were a year ago. The problem I see for banks, though, is whilst their margins are decreasing, it's partially their own fault. Essentially, it seems like the banks have simply lent too much money. As a result, they've had to borrow from overseas and they've had to borrow from other sources, and that funding's more expensive. So it's putting pressure on their margins, and nobody refers to this. Banks now lend 90-95% of the value of a house. They used to lend 70%. They're simply lending more money than they used to 20 years ago. That money's got to come from somewhere. We can't, on one hand, demand 95% mortgages, on the other hand, complain when the cost of that mortgage goes up because it's not controlled by the RBA.
But it's because household debt's so high that people don't have the money to save, so that the banks don't have the deposits from which to draw their local funds.
Which sort of comes first? Well, I mean, if they went back to perhaps 70% and you've got to provide 30% or even 10-15%, and the bank lends you the rest, I mean that would sort of help. But
well, it would put a huge dampener on the housing market, wouldn't it?
Well, right,
and house prices would come down.
Well, the other pressure, isn't it, is that obviously rates on deposits, term deposits, they've had to be much more competitive about that because if what did Adam say? It's 40%, isn't it, offshore, and then 60% roughly from home base, obviously wholesale and retail type funding, but they are paying more to depositors. So does that put more pressure on their margins?
Yes, it would. But I noticed that the Commonwealth didn't really move on their NetSaver account. They moved on their mortgages, but not on their NetSaver.
Yes, they haven't. They haven't lifted that